wants to listen to it.
This meeting is being recorded.
Okay. All right, I want to talk about something interesting. Over Yontif, we were talking a lot about the first few psukim, the beginning of creation, and so I wanted to move on, like later on in the parsha for tonight. But then over Yontif, something caught my eye, which I thought was so interesting. So I ended up getting all caught up in it, and I was researching it, and I just thought it was very, very interesting. So we're going to talk about that. All right, that's a question that I don't think I ever thought about it, and I don't know. I wouldn't be surprised if people here didn't really think about it, but apparently in the medieval commentators they did think about this a lot. All right, now I'll read you the way the Ramban asks the question. All right, the Ramban says that V'im tevakesh bria l'malachim she'enam guf. All right, why doesn't the Torah ever mention the creation of angels? Right, angels are going to be such an important part of the world, as the stories move on in the Torah. So there's all these references to angels. So why in all the 7 days of creation, right, or really 6 days of creation and Shabbos, right? Why in that whole period is there never any mention in the Torah about when the angels were created, right? The angels are these all-important messengers that God sends. So why didn't the Torah ever mention them? Like I said, I never really thought about this. And I'll tell you why I think we don't really think about this so much. But it's an interesting question. Okay, so I want to go through a few different answers, and we'll see that there's some, you could imagine there's some wild stuff about this issue. Okay, so let me go to the first answer that I think is probably the reason most of us don't ask this question. All right, and this is in the Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam, who are sort of the most grounded, right? The most focused on the words. And they both say that the Torah doesn't talk about things that are not physical. Okay. The Torah is only talking about creation, things that we see, but the Torah is not interested really in things that we can't see, all right, in non-physical entities. And the Rashbam has two other examples. He says, for example, the Torah never talked about the creation of Gehenna. Right? Gehenim's like the place where sinners are punished in the next world. The Torah never talked about that, right? It never talked about the creation of this place, right? Likewise, the Torah never talked about Masa Merkava, which is like the throne of God, the glory of the, whatever that means. God doesn't have any physical form, but God sort of has this majestic court on heaven. The Torah never talked about the creation of Masa Merkava or Gehenna. So it's the same thing, right? Why didn't the Torah ever mention any of these things? So the answer is, says the Rashbam and the Ibn Ezra, that the Torah only is focused on the creation of physical things, but to the creation of these spiritual entities that we can't see, right? Like angels or the Masa Merkava or all these things, so that the Torah is not going to tell us about the creation of that. Okay, so again, I think that's the Ibn Ezra and the Rashbam are sort of the most non-mystical, the most practical commentators. So I think, they're probably look at it the way we look at it, which is, the Torah is not going to get involved in all sorts of magical or mystical things. Okay. So that's approach number one. Now, the problem is the Abarbanel has a discussion of this whole thing. The Abarbanel points out that the Torah is very comfortable with angels, right? Avraham has angels. There's all sorts of angels that keep appearing all over the Torah. So the Torah is comfortable discussing angels. Why should creation be the only time that's an exception? Right? In other words, we don't talk about angels because we don't see angels. But the Torah that does see angels and talks about it explicitly, so why shouldn't it talk about the creation of angels? All right, so that's his question. Okay, now I'll tell you another approach number two. Okay, this comes from Rabbeinu Bachya. This is also, okay, you might think about this when you make Kiddush from now on. All right, he says that he was a little bit, he had like a mystical side. He says something very interesting. Okay, he says that the first pasuk of our Kiddush, right? How do we start off with the Kiddush? Vayechulu hashamayim b'haaretz v'chol tziva'am. Right, that he finished the creation of the heavens and the earth and tziva'am. They're like minions. They're, they're troops, whatever it is. Right, what are we talking about? I don't even think Rashi has a comment on that. Let me just double check that. Yeah, Rashi doesn't even comment on that, right? Well, what are all these extra things that are out there, right? Shamayim Aretz, heaven and earth, good. What's Tziva'am? So he explains, Rabbi Bachya explains that's a reference to the angels. The Tziva'am, the troops of heaven are the angels. All right, so that's where the Torah is referencing. Again, it doesn't tell us in the midst of the story when they were created, but he says that that's a reference to the creation of the angels. All right, so next time you're making kiddush, you can think about that if you want. Okay, so that's the first two approaches. Okay, again, either the Torah is not getting involved in magical things, things that aren't scientific, or that the Torah did allude to it in the word Siva. Okay, now I want to go to the Ramban. The Ramban says two other approaches. Okay, and this is where it gets a little wild. Okay, so first he quotes from the Medrash, okay, from the rabbis. What does the Medrash have to say? The Darshu Bahem Shenivra'u Biyom Sheni Shelo Tomar Shesiu Bibrias Ha'olam. The Medrash says that the angels were created on the second day, and the reason was so that no one should think that God needed their help to create the world. Right? So that God created light and darkness on the first day. So he only created the angels, these like beings, these forces, whatever, that do God's will. He only created them on the second day to show that he's able to create the world totally on his own, and he doesn't need them. They're just carrying out his commands, but he doesn't need them in any way. Okay. Now that's the Ramban only quotes half that Medrash. There's another view in the Medrash that he created them on the fifth day. Okay. So again, in order to illustrate that God is able to create the world on his own without the angels, that's why he created them, later on in creation. So that's the first interpretation. I'm not exactly sure. I don't think the Ramban, that's not a full answer why the Torah doesn't mention it, right? That's just an answer as to why they were sort of created later on in the process, but why the Torah doesn't mention it, I don't see how that totally answers it. But I guess the point is we're trying to minimize, the place of the angels in creation to drive home, right? We really want to emphasize that God is the only power in the world. The angels are just his mindless messengers. Okay. So that's okay. Now says the Ramban. Now I'm going to say what's really up until now everything's been sort of standard. Okay. Now this blew my mind. Okay. The Ramban says, right? I mentioned this problem on Yantif, but let me just repeat it. One of the big problems. I shouldn't even put it that way. But, right? There's a famous problem. I don't know if it's a big problem, but there's a famous problem that the Torah should have started off Elokim bara Bereishit. Right, that God created in the beginning, because the way it's said, it gives room to think that Bereishis is some sort of God who created Elokim, right? Bereishis bara Elokim. You could read it not in the beginning God created, but Bereishis, right? This guy created God, so it's a big problem, right? Again, I don't. Okay, let me just review this actually for a minute. The Gemara, the Talmud has a story that there were 70 rabbis that had to translate the Torah, right? And there were certain problems that they identified, and it was a miracle that they all solved in the same way. But one of the problems, I guess the first problem, was this very problem. Okay, so they all switched it in their translation to say Elokim bara Bereishis. Okay. Now says the Ramban, though, something unbelievable. Why does it say Bereishis bara Elokim, right? At the end of the day, fine, very good, right? We all know that God, nothing's before God. God's the only power. God's the only thing. And we all understand that grammatically it should have been Elokim bara Bereishis, right? We get that. Meaning we're not dealing with, the heretics can say whatever they want, but right, we're dealing with there's, sorry, I'll just add this in. I just remember this right now. At the beginning of the Hertz Chumash, the old Hertz Chumashes, so he has a long introduction there against biblical criticism. Right? That was his thing. He has a long refutation of all the biblical critics. So in the beginning, he says that the biblical critics claim that the Torah stories just came from all these secular stories. So he compares one of the ancient legends about how the world was created with the Torah's story. And he shows how ridiculous it is to think that there's any correlation. But I wish I had a copy of it. It's almost funny. It's worth reading through if you see a copy of it. It's almost funny the way the legend he quotes, because it's so ridiculous. It's so nonsensical. And basically it's I don't know, Galed created, Mastu created, Pastu created, Fastu created, Lotstu. It just goes on and on, all this nonsense until the world gets created, right? So he points out that that's like totally, in other words, the idea that the Torah came from that is ridiculous. But either way, I always think that that's, in other words, someone who came from that tradition would be likely to read Bereishit as some sort of God who created Elohim, right? In other words, to us, it doesn't even sound like a compelling issue, but back in the day, all these pagans, that is how they thought, right? That is how they really thought about it. Okay, so either way, so that's why it was a big problem, but it was resolved. But now, why did the Torah write it in this confusing way, right? Why not say Elohim bara Bereishit? Okay, so the Ramban says something unbelievable. Okay, give me a minute to say it and then to analyze it and then I'll post some questions on it. All right, because it's gonna. If you haven't heard this before, it'll probably be surprising. Okay, so the Ramban says that, you know what? Let me read it to you. He says about Tizke Tavin Sod Milas Bereishis. He says if you merit, then you'll understand the secret of the word Bereishis. The Lama Lo Hiktim Lomar Elokim Bara Bereishis. Why it didn't say Elokim Bara Bereishis. Teda Ki Al Derech HaEmes. So according to the Kabbalah, according to the mysticism, Hakasuv Yagid Batachtonim, the Yirmos Ba'elyonim, because it's actually alluding to the creation of the angels. Okay, how? Umilas Bereishis Tirmos Bechachma Shehi Reishis Haroshim Kasher Karti. All right, the word Bereishis really refers to like the beginning of all beginnings, right? Which is wisdom. All right, this is like Kabbalistic stuff, but even in the davening, we say, right at the beginning, we say Reishis Chachma Yiras Elokim. That well, actually no, that's a little different, right? But okay, right. The beginning of the beginning, so to speak, like the foundation of everything is wisdom. So with wisdom, all right, and he quotes it, the Targum Yerushalmi says also with wisdom. So Bereishis doesn't just mean in the beginning, but it means the wisdom of creation was Elokim. Right? What does the word Elokim mean? Again, don't eat my head off for 5 minutes. What does the word Elokim actually mean? Right? When we use the word Elokim in the Torah, so very often it means a secular judge, right? Like an authority, right? An authority you call an Elohim actually, right? Because it's not a sanctified name, right? It's a secular name. So what does this Elokim in the verse mean? Says the Ramban, it's a reference to the angels Elokim, meaning these authorities, not God. So the way to read this pasuk is Bereishis, with wisdom, God created the Elokim, which is the angels. Okay? You have to insert the word God over there. Okay? So that's how the Ramban understands this verse. That's why I didn't say Elokim bara Bereishis, because it's not just telling us that God created the world. It's hinting at the very creation of the angels, which is Bereishis at the beginning with wisdom, right? With wisdom, God created the Elokim, which are the angels. Okay, unbelievable. Okay, so according to the Ramban, right, that's the secret, right? I mean, if you've ever wondered why is the Torah written in this confusing way instead of just saying Elokim bara Bereishis, so that's the Ramban's explanation, and that answers where's the creation of angels alluded to in the Torah, right? The whole problem that we began with is it never says anything about the creation of the angels. So the answer is that the angels are alluded to in that word Elokim, which doesn't necessarily refer to God. It could mean authorities. Okay. Now, before I come to the problems with this, and there are some problems, but before I get there, I want to just tell you an unbelievable thing, which is that the Ibn Ezra also has a discussion of this word Elokim, and he, I would say, says something sort of similar. All right. He says he's bothered by a few issues. First of all, he's bothered by also a very interesting issue, which is that Elokim, and I don't know, okay, I don't know the grammar enough over here, but he says that Elokim is a plural word, right? So this is a very big problem, right? Because now the word we use for God, Elokim, is a plural word, and obviously God is one. That's right. That's the whole point. Shema Yisrael, right? Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. So the Ramban, so the Ibn Ezra says that Kikol Lashon Yesh Lo Derech Kavod. He says that Elokim is actually, it is plural, but it's also a way of expressing respect. All right, and he says like, right, he says like in Arabic, B'lashon Yishmael, right? Someone speaking to a king speaks in a plural language. All right, B'lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew, the way of respect is to speak to a great person with in a plural language. All right, we have things like this in English also. I don't think we do plural, but we do third person, for example, right? Third person is maybe more respectful. Also, we have like certain terms in English that are considered respectful as opposed to other terms. So, right, like let's say like, I don't know, like guys, right, is less like respectful than like sir, right? We have formal, right? So the formal is to say it in plural. So that's why Elohim is a plural, even though it's theologically, it doesn't make that much sense, but it's not trying to say that there's two gods, obviously. It's a way of expressing respect for God. Okay, so that's his first problem. But then he brings up this other problem, which is not only, right, that's problem number one, that it's plural, but problem number two is that it can also refer to other people, right, to angels, to authorities, to judges, right? So how could we use a word for God which has the meaning of other things? Okay, so all right, now I can't find it, but okay. So I'll just tell you what he says. Okay, so the Ibn Ezra says something very interesting. I can't find it inside over here right now, but okay. Okay, he says something very interesting. He says, again, the same thing, right? We have to look at the way we use language. He says, for example, right, we talk about the lips speaking, right? Lips don't, okay, again, I don't know if this is biologically true. So he says lips don't speak. It comes from your mouth. Your lips don't speak. So why do we say your lips are speaking? Just because it looks like the sound is coming from your lips. So the way we use words is how it looks, not how it's actually being done, right? Our language reflects how it looks, not the way it is in reality. He gives another example, right? We use the word lave, a heart, right? We use the word heart to mean a soul, right? People use the word heart in reference like to a soul, right? Your soul, but we call it a heart. Your heart is is just a biological like organ that you need, that moves your blood around. It's not your soul, right? Your soul is something different from your heart. But it looks to us, in other words, the heart is what keeps you alive, right? It's what keeping you alive. So we call it the soul. So again, language follows how things look rather than how they actually are. So in the same way, says the Ibn Ezra, that's why we call it Elohim. Because how do we experience God? We experience him through the angels and the messengers that he sends, right? So those messengers are meaning, so what do we see? We don't see God himself, of course, right? God is there's no way for a human being really to perceive God. Maybe Moshe, I don't know, but a human being can't perceive God, right? Even the angel, even prophets, God speaks to them in a dream or whatever it is, right? There's got to be some sort of intermediary between us and God. So that's what we call Elohim, the angels. So that's why we call God Elohim, because that's how we perceive him, right? It's like we think the lips speak. We think the heart is the soul. We think that we think the angels are God, but God is above all of that. Okay, there again, these are, everything you learn in this parsha is so like fundamental, because it's like all the first, everything's being defined. Okay, I think this is an unbelievable thing, because we use this word Elohim all the time, right? And according to the Ibn Ezra, I'm sure there's a disagreement about this, but according to the Ibn Ezra, it's actually a reference to the angels, which is how we perceive God. Okay, so my point in quoting this is that both the Ibn Ezra and the Ramban differently, but both of them are associating, they're both bothered by the same issue, right? That the word Elohim means angels, not God really, right? It means authorities. And they're both, so why are we using it to call God? So they're both bothered by this issue. So they both say that, yeah, you're right. On some level, it does mean angels, even though obviously we're referring to God when we use that in the Torah, usually, or very often, but it does mean angels. But it also does mean angels, right? According to the Ibn Ezra, that's how we perceive God. And according to the Ramban, it's hinting at the creation of angels, the way it's phrased. Okay. Now, so that said, and again, the Ibn Ezra, the Ramban are very important commentators. So that's certainly a valid approach. But there are some problems. And the Abarbanel points out some of the problems here, right? So I just want to go through the Abarbanel's problems. And then these are probably some of the problems that you're thinking of. Okay, and then I'll tell you what the Abarbanel himself says. First of all, he asks that, right, he says that when we use Elohim in this story, it's clearly a reference to God, right? We're not talking about angels creating anything. We're talking about God. So what's the Ramban talking about that suddenly the word Elohim in the first pasuk means God, angels, right? It's not possible. It means God. Second of all, he says the Ramban's reading is super problematic because you're taking out the word God, right? The noun God from the first verse. You're saying in the beginning the angels were created. It never said God explicitly, right? So the Barbanel says this is very problematic. Like I said, I think probably what the Ramban really says is not that the verse means something different. It's just hinting at something, right? Of course, it means that God created in the beginning, but it's hinting at the fact that he created the angels at that point. But even the Barbanel's issues are correct. To say that that's a reference to the angels is very problematic, right? Because this is the foundation of our belief that God created the world. So to say that this is talking about angels is really crazy stuff. And then he asks another question, which is, how does the Medrash says that the angels were created on the second day or the fifth day to show that God can create the world by himself? So that Barbanel says, well, why didn't he create them on the sixth day at the end? Right? In other words, this Rabbeinu Bachya might make more sense on this, right? Because it says that he finished creating the heavens and the earth and the angels, right? So it sounds like the last thing he created were the angels. That makes sense because then you're showing that you can create everything before you create the angels. But according to the Medrash, why would he create them on the second day or the fifth day, right? He should have created everything to show that he's the only authority. And then after that, he could create the angels, right? Why create them in the middle of the process? Okay, so Barbanel says something which I think is a very nice idea. He says that God was not concerned that the angels, that people or whatever people were going to make a mistake, that he needed the angels in order to create like our world, right? He doesn't need angels to create wood or chairs or buildings. That's for sure not. The problem was that people are going to think that God needs the angels to create the heavenly realms, which are much more impressive than this world, right? That's the real stuff, the heavenly realms. So that's why God was waiting up until he created the heavenly realm. So that's the debate in the Medrash. One rabbi believes that he waited until the second day because he had already created the heaven, right? The heavens and the earth, right? That's what it says. It's not clear exactly when he created all this stuff, meaning there's debates when he created all this stuff. But let's say it says that he already created the Shamayim. So after he created Shemayim, then he created the angels because, okay, now everyone knows that he can create the Shemayim on his own. The other rabbi holds that he had to wait until he created the heaven and the stars and the moons and all that, which was on the fourth day. And then on the fifth day, he created the angels. All right. So that's the debate. But God doesn't need us. God doesn't need angels. That's for sure. He doesn't need angels to create the lower parts. It was only the upper parts that might have been in doubt. So that's why he waited either until the second day or the fourth day. All right. Okay. So that's some of the basic discussion. I just want to make one more point briefly, just because the Ibn Ezra brings it up. It's very, very fascinating point. But again, okay. So just to review that first bit, the question that the Ramban begins with is, why doesn't the Torah ever mention the creation of the angels? Right? They're so important. And we just saw four basic answers, either because the Torah is focused on, physical things, not things we don't see. Option number two is that it's alluded to somewhere in the Torah. Option number three is that maybe God wanted to minimize, so to speak, the role that the angels might have played in the world. He didn't want anyone to think that he needed them. And option number four is this, very interesting idea from the Ramban and maybe even Ibn Ezra on some level, that Elohim in the first pasuk is alluding to the creation of the angels. All right, which is maybe a problematic idea. Okay, now let me just end with one last thing over here. Okay, the Ibn Ezra brings this up right here. Okay, once he gets into this whole issue of angels and this and that, so he brings up this issue. Okay, and this became like a very important debate. He says that Rav Sadia Gaon wrote what we all think. I'm sorry, not what we think. All right, Amar Shaha'adam Nechbad Behamalachim. Okay, I'm sorry, not what we think. Rav Sadia Gaon said, and this will be surprising, that people are a higher level than angels, right? We all think, and we'll see where we get this from in a minute, but we all think that angels are, the holiest of the holies, right? Because they never do anything wrong. They just do exactly what God told them to do. So they're the holiest beings in the world. We human beings do so many things wrong, so we're way below the angels. That's what we think. Rav Sadia Gaon said, no, the opposite. People are more sanctified. They're on a higher level than angels. Why? Because we have free will. right? There's no sanctity in just doing it like a machine. God tells you to do something and you go do it like a machine. That's not, you're just a machine, right? An angel is just a machine. But a human has a choice, right? They have free will. They could do the right thing. They could do the wrong thing. We do the right thing. So we're better than the angels. That's what Rav Sadia Gaon said. People are more sanctified than the angels. Says the Ibn Ezra, no way. Okay, he says, no way can you say that people are better than angels. And with Ibn Ezra, everything's textual, right? He's always just interested in what the Psukim say. He says, because the Psukim contradict that, right? What happens later on, right? Throughout the Tanakh, when people encounter angels, they always treat them respectfully. So, for example, when Yehoshua, who's the leader of the Jewish people, right, when he sees an angel, he falls down and bows in front of him, right? He treats him with tremendous respect. And he says also, Zechariah, Daniel, he says, I'm not even going to go on at length about this, right? This is an obvious point. When even the greatest people in the Tanakh, the leaders of the Jewish people, the greatest people, when they see angels, they treat them respectfully. So it's clear in the Tanakh, says the Ibn Ezra, that angels are better than people. Okay, so this is the debate. Again, this is sort of a famous, I don't know, not famous, but right, this is like an important debate. What's better? There's no practical relevance to this in any way, right? Because we're all people and you don't have any choice about it. Right, so what's that show, Touched by an Angel or something, where they all become angels? Okay, right, but everyone's a person, that's it. So there's nothing practical about this, but just interesting, right? Because we're so used to thinking that angels are better. Now, the Rambam, who's not so much into the text, right? He was more a philosopher. So he also came out like very, very much on the Ibn Ezra's path, right? That the Rambam was very against the whole idea, which Rav Sadia Gaon believes, that people are sort of the point of creation, right? And the Rambam disagreed about that. Again, this I'm out of time over here, but this would be an interesting issue to talk about, another time at length. But the Rambam. Wait, let me just throw two things in the last minute here. But the Rambam. Right, the Rambam on a philosophical level believe that we can't think like that, right? We should think that we're just one small part of the world. There's a whole world out there. Who knows what's going on, right? We're just one little small part of it. And so we should also believe that angels are better than people. All right, so again, you have the Rambam, the Ibn Ezra, saying that the people are better, the angels are better than people. So that's, those are very, very authoritative commentators. Now, what's interesting, I'll just note this very briefly, that later on in history, okay, there was the Rav Sadia Gaon's position did get some support from the Maharal, who was a very, very great thinker much later. And he did believe that people were on a higher level than angels, which is just interesting to note. And the Nefesh HaChaim, which is from Rav Chaim Balozhiner, probably like 300 years ago or so. So he has a way, he thinks that he can sort of like combine them, all right, that there's no, he can make both of them right, all right. So this was an issue that was revisited. It's not so simple, but the Ibn Ezra begins the discussion on this first, on these early verses over here. All right, thank you everyone for joining us, and yeah, let me just stop. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think you said earlier, wave